Hello there and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevicius. Today's guests are Doctors Murrell and Quentin Faulkners, wonderful organists, experts on sacred music and very important Bach scholars. And in general, very inspiring people whom I had privilege to meet while I and Osha were studying during our doctoral program at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So for 2.5 years, Quentin Faulkner was my organ professor, and his wife, Murrell, together with him, worked at St. Mark's on the campus Episcopal Church there in Lincoln. And they both led magnificent church music program. With, of course, a pinnacle of it was elegant and beautiful Italian Baroque style Jean Bedian's organ. And today I'm really excited to talk about something that is dear and near to my heart about Bach's organ world, because for the fourth time they just returned from central Germany, from these lands where Bach either worked or visited, places that are very important for any lover of Bach's music, either organist or otherwise. Basically these lands are Saxony and Thuringia, and it's fascinating because not so long ago these lands were closed to the tourists, to visitors, because this was part of Eastern Germany, right? And only very recently people from the Western world had a privilege to visit there and even to try some of these instruments and touch them and listen to these sounds. So let's go to this conversation and find out all there is to know about how Bach's organs are constructed, how they feel, what's the feeling when the organist plays them, and wonderful other things. I cannot even describe what we talked about. I know you will learn a lot because I did too. So let's go to the show. Usually I start these conversations with asking people how they first fell in love with the organ. But since we're going to talk about Bach and his historical places and his organs, let me start this conversation with asking you about how you first fell in love with Bach.
That would have to go a very long, way back in my memory. I can't remember actually a time that I wasn't fascinated with him and his music. Certainly, that was cemented in my mind and in my enthusiasm when I went to college and began actually to study the organ formally. I had no formal organ instruction before I went to college, but when I did and I heard Bach's music on the organ, I fell in love, and I've been in love with it for the rest of my life.
And you, Murrell?
Well, I know as a piano student, it was always Bach that I wanted to play, and so I can't say when the time began. It just was always there.
Of course, Bach is beginning and end for every musician, like Alpha and Omega, right?
True.
Wonderful. So, before playing organ, Quentin, did you do something else, or you started very early?
My early keyboard instruction was pretty spotty because my mother had studied. She was actually a piano major in college, a 2-year college. But at that point, I was the first of 4 sons, and so she was a very busy woman. So she would play the piano occasionally, and we would do it. But she had no great love for Bach. So I cannot tell you when I first encountered his music. Probably in any meaningful degree, not until I entered college.
Uh-huh. And Murrell, before playing piano, did you play some other instruments, or maybe you did some other activities? How was it in your early memories?
I began piano when I was about 7, and it was a class piano situation in the public schools. And I didn't begin private lessons until several years later. I did things such as eurythmics and dance classes and this kind of thing, but no other musical training.
Uh-huh. So I see. So Bach later entered in both of your lives, right? And it remained probably one of the main inspirations ever since, right?
No question about it. In many ways, it can be said that I built my career around Bach. I published material about Bach, books and articles, and he's been sort of my morning star in terms of music.
Exactly. Well, and how about Murrell? Do you feel that Bach is always on your mind every day, or there are some days that you might forget our great master?
Oh, I suppose I'd have to be honest and say there are days I don't think about music.
Me too, yeah. But it's fascinating that we can count our lineage as organ students, organ players maybe, and I've counted through our former teachers that really we can trace back our lineage back to Bach, basically, or even earlier to Sweelinck if we want. Yeah. So it's really fascinating that we are continuing this tradition, isn't it?
Absolutely. That would be a fascinating study for someone to see to what degree Bach and his students actually connect with the modern world. I would be willing to venture a guess that many, at least German organists, could easily trace their lineage back to Bach through one of his students.
So anyway, it's so great that today in this 21st century we can still have some places that have the memory of the Bach presence, basically places that he lived, he visited, right? He played, and places others remember Bach. And since you were on this tour, so I'm curious, what's it like to be in these places for you? What do you feel when you go to Germany, to former eastern part of Germany, to Thuringia and Saxonia?
Oh, the range of emotions is hard, is really hard to describe. I guess for me, the greatest thrill is the fact that when you play some of the organs, in particular Altenburg and Naumburg, when you play those organs, you know that you are playing the keys and pulling the stops that J.S. Bach played on, because that is documented. There is no question. Also, Sturmtal, that's equally the case. A smaller organ, but also its lineage, its connection with Bach is well documented.
Yeah, and what about you, Murrell? Do you feel any special feeling when you sit on the bench of these historical organs? Is it exciting? Do you feel some kind of uplifting of your spirit as opposed to other instruments that you play?
Well, it's just a knowledge behind of what you're doing, the fact you realize the great tradition that is there with those instruments. That being said, they are fantastic instruments. and a joy to play.
Yeah. Whether or not they're connected with Bach, they are absolutely spectacular instruments. I would have to say that part of my feeling when I sit at these instruments is also a certain degree of apprehension, because, of course, as Americans, we are very used to AGO standard organ dimensions and specifications. And most of the organs that we play are either those instruments built with those, according to those guidelines, or they're instruments perhaps from the second half of the 19th century, which are quite similar to modern instruments in various ways. When you play the instruments that go back into the 18th century and earlier, such as Naumburg and Altenburg and Sturmtal, standard dimensions for organs, and that would, and it's not so much a matter of keys, but certainly pedals. The pedal boards have no standard, and so I end up often memorizing the music and looking at my feet to be sure that I get at least as many pedal notes as possible. If you play these instruments over a period of weeks or months even, then obviously you get used to those dimensions. But just coming in on a tour and having to sit down and play a piece cold is somewhat causes a certain degree of apprehension.
And also you would have to mention the touch of many of these instruments. We here have cultivated a keyboard touch that is very sensitive and counts on the keys to respond to sensitive handling, as it were. Many of these instruments are industrial strength, and you just need lots and lots of strength to play them.
Yeah. They're tendinitis waiting to happen.
That's true. And you mentioned, of course, the touch, the different kind of touch, and probably different kind of technique when you play these historical organs. Do you think that it's wise to play modern instruments in the way that you would play historical organs as well, or you should have two separate techniques?
Well, I think that most organists are almost required to develop various kinds of touch, because it's pretty clear that the kind of touch that's appropriate for Bach, in which at least there are surely some remnants of earlier fingering, requires a particular kind of touch. And of course, more modern touch, such as was developed in the second half of the 19th century, that requires substitution and that sort of thing for a perfectly smooth legato, is quite another kind of touch. So this is just simply something that is required of organists if you want to play music of differing periods with the greatest authenticity possible.
Was it difficult for you to learn two separate techniques, historical technique with articulation and legato technique for modern organ music, legato technique for 19th century organ music? Basically, did you have some troubles to switching back and forth when you were a student?
When I was a student, early fingering practice was not part of the training. Everything was legato. And I only learned later to begin to use, I guess I started by looking for ways to play the articulation I wanted to hear. And only later did I begin to learn about how fingering influences that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Quentin, what influence on your modern and historical keyboard technique had these historical instruments that you had the privilege to play, like Gene Bedian style instruments on University of Nebraska Lincoln campus, even other instruments that you usually encountered?
I guess to answer the first part of your question, I did not, and this would hold true for Mary Murrell as well. We did not learn the two techniques at the same time, so that helped. There was when we went to college, and actually Mary Murrell studied organ before that, we were taught essentially the 19th century legato technique with substitution. And I would say we were playing the organ for at least 20 years or more, using that technique exclusively. Then came the time when people began to do, in particular, under the influence of Harold Vogel, American organists began to interest themselves in earlier techniques. That is when both of us then began to practice and to develop the earlier technique, which does not include finger substitution, but rather the idea of rapid shifts of motion of the fingers between various keys. So for us, it was probably, we were able to keep the two techniques separate because we learned them at different times.
Mm-hmm. That helps, of course, when a student starts to learn to play the organ and is introduced to both techniques at the same time. What might happen sometimes is this confusion, right? When to play with the thumb, when to play legato, when to play substitution, when to play with the heels, even when you're playing pedals also. So I kind of might say that yes, you were lucky that you first mastered the legato technique, and then only then you mastered the historical technique.
My opinion with that and the procedure that I followed was, especially with a pianist who was beginning organ, we would use, and I know George Ritchie was the same, we would use modern technique first. We would develop that and those skills because that is the greatest difference between the piano and the organ. I mean, that's really something very different. Pianists, and let's face it, almost everyone who studies organ has studied piano before organ study. You're used to just shifting the fingers with the piano. You've sort of got that down. Obviously, the shift has to happen more quickly on the organ because the sound stops the minute you remove your fingers from the keys. Depressing the keys. But it seems to me that it bears more resemblance to the kind of technique that pianists have. And so it's more important to develop the 19th century legato technique first and then turn to the other when they have mastered that.
That's completely true, Quentin. I completely agree. And yet I'd like to ask Mary Murrell, since you first mastered legato technique and only later this historical touch, right? But you also played in your early years historical pieces like early organ literature like Bach, Buxtehude, right? Yeah. With legato technique, probably. I would assume. So, Mary Murrell, can you say, was it difficult for you to switch suddenly or not so suddenly from legato to historical technique? Sort of relearn, basically, this technique?
Well, it means going back and relearning pieces, refingering them, and it's just a matter of relearning them then, because the result needs to be so different from the way I played it the first time.
Yes, I agree. I remember also I was raised as an organist with more or less articulated technique, but it was not as completely historical as I would later learn in United States from Pamela, Reuter-Finstra, Quentin, and George. It wasn't as complete system basically, and comprehensive system. So I kind of had to relearn some pedaling and fingering, but it was a little bit easier for me because I think because I still articulate most of the early pieces that I played.
Yes.
So wonderful.
I have to say that our early training was not totally legato. There was often articulation, though I think it had no cerebral part to it. It was just what sounded nice, cute, or something. But it certainly did not follow any rules or ways that were logical.
I would agree with that, and I would add that kind of articulation was normally designed to bring out certain phrases as the performer or the teacher perceived them in the music. But those phrases, within those phrases, it was essentially modern legato.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we have to be, of course, honest and say that even the legato touch that, for example, Straube used or Dupré used was not complete legato, right? They had some their system of their own to bring out, as you say, different phrases and shades of articulation. But that, of course, was so much different from what we learned later from these treatises that Bach's and other composers, contemporaries wrote, right?
Yes, I think so. The type of articulation that we were taught, I'd have to say, by our earlier teachers was entirely arbitrary. There was no scholarly component to it at all. And in fact, the major teacher with whom we studied really had a disdain for learning, the study of ancient treatises and this sort of thing. He considered it pretty much a waste of time. And so that's something we didn't agree with him on, but the most diplomatic thing to do was to not say anything and to rather to accept and to profit from what he had to teach us.
And of course, when you are sitting on the bench of the modern instrument, sometimes these historical techniques don't make any sense, right? Or I should say might not make any sense because, for example, you might play with your heels quite successfully on modern pedal boards or AGO standard pedal boards, right?
There's
when
no
you go to these places that Bach worked, like in Thuringia and Saxonia, of course, then you discover something else.
Yeah, I would have to say that good common sense would tell anyone that Bach was certainly no fool, and we all know that his technical ability was legendary. That Bach never substituted a finger is patent foolishness. Obviously, there are situations where it's helpful to do that. That Bach never used his heels. I think, again, that's ridiculous. It's made more difficult, perhaps, by the kind of shoes that a person would be wearing, because I think at that time, at least from paintings that I've seen, men's shoes tended to have a rather low heel. But it's certainly, as I say, he was not stupid, and he could have certainly figured out that he could substitute a finger on a key and that he could play certain notes with his heels because it was easier to do. The difference between that and the modern technique is a matter of consistency, of doing it all the time.
Exactly. And of course, the system, right? The system, we should be quite frank and say that even pieces that were written some 200 years before Bach, like Schlick, right? Arnold Schlick wrote some, remember this Ascendo ad Patrem Meam for 10 voices on the organ, where the right hand plays 3 parts, the left hand plays 3 parts, the right foot plays 2 parts, and the left foot also plays 2 parts. Basically, you have to play not only with your toe or with your heel, but you have to play both of them at the same time, right?
And that's absolutely true. And of course, what you're dealing with there is the same sort of thing that you encounter with Bach. That is spectacularly gifted people who are capable of doing technical feats beyond what any of us mortals seem to be able to do. And if you are so supremely gifted as that, most of these questions really become inconsequential, because you simply have the ability, you're almost born with the ability to do those things. And again, there's nothing that we can say about that because they are so long gone.
Exactly. So, Murrell, when you go to these historical places, to Leipzig, to Dresden, right, to Naumburg, to Altenburg, I think this year you didn't go to Altenburg because the church was under reparation, right? But
Correct.
But still, these places. So, Murrell, do you feel any kind of special ancient historical smell in these historical buildings? Or is it so modern German way with medications and special chemicals, very clean and precise? Or is it still this historical feeling preserved, like in Lithuania, for example, when you go to village churches from 19th century and even from the 18th century, where we have this ancient 1776 Adam Gottlob Kasparini organ in Vilnius, Holy Ghost Church. The first thing you basically feel when entering this ancient building is this smell, different kind of smell from the concert hall, different kind of smell from any other building you encounter.
Let me leap in here. I think one of the things you have to realize is that, with the exception of Sturmtal, which is pretty much original because it's out in the country and it's been repaired, but it really didn't need to be restored. But all of the other instruments and those churches have been, after the fall of the wall and the subsequent reunification of Germany, they've all been carefully restored. And so while the material is original, it's all cleaned up.
Uh-huh.
And so there's no old smell. If anything, there is the slight smell of the new kinds of varnishes or whatever had to be used to restore the instrument. I don't think that there's any kind of musty smell or any of that kind of thing. This is the sort of thing you do encounter more in Catholic churches because you can have the smell of incense and that sort of thing. But we visited entirely Lutheran churches, and so I don't think, at least I don't notice any special kind of smell.
Uh-huh. But the organs, of course, are more or less original, right? More or less some materials original, right?
Yes and no. They are, well, let's use Naumburg, for example, because that's pretty well documented. The organ was, and I cannot tell you the exact date, but I suspect it was in the earlier part of the 20th century. The organ was turned into our it had an electric key action.
Mm-hmm.
But that key action was connected to the original trackers. And the other thing about Naumburg is, and this is really important, that I believe it was the musicologist and organ specialist Christhard Marenholtz who insisted that that organ be photographed, every square inch of that organ, inside and out, before they did that. Now, that was of enormous help because the organ restorers could go to those photographs and look at it, and actually tell what is happening. But in this case, you see a fair amount of what was there originally is replacement. And so it's often very difficult for people like us who really know very little about organ, the structure of the organ, much less a particular organ. It's very difficult for us to say anything about, what it feels like, what it was like, because it's just not known.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, so fascinating that you have these historical instruments which were changed somewhat or drastically changed somewhat during the passage of times, but then when the awareness of historical techniques was so high in Europe, they basically try to restore the organs the right way, right? Trying to recreate the instrument, the organ, the environment in a way that Bach probably would have also liked it.
Most of these instruments are restored to a specific time period. They chose which version of the organ to use. The organ in Pomsen that we played is a case in point. It was modified several times, and in restoring it, they chose a specific year to which they restored that instrument.
I think also it is to the eternal credit of the government of the reunited Germany of East and West that they recognize just how significant these instruments are to the history of German arts and culture. And so they spared no expense to return them to as close as possible to the state, to their original state when they were built. I can tell you, for example, that at Naumburg, which is unquestionably the Bach organ, if you have to pick a single organ that is the Bach organ, that's the instrument. And Naumburg, I heard a figure that instrument, the restoration of that instrument, cost over 4 million euros. Now that's enormously more than the instrument was built for, the amount of money for which the instrument was built. I remember looking at being inside the structure of the instrument at one point. We were looking at something, and I noticed that in one of the subsequent repairs and changes, some organ builder or organ builders had drilled a hole in a piece of a flat piece of wood, a hole for perhaps electric cables or something like that. And it was perhaps an inch in diameter. And in the restoration, not only had that hole been plugged with a piece of wood that was exactly of the same type and color as the original, as what was around it, but the restorers matched the grains, so that the only thing you could see, the grains ran just exactly the same over the plug as elsewhere. I can't imagine where they found a piece of wood where they could do that. The only thing you could see was the slight outline of the circle where the plug had been put in. So the German government spared no expense to restore these really unique monuments to German culture.
Fascinating, Quentin, fascinating. And in Lithuania, for example, we have some historical organs, of course, and when these restoration projects are underway, the scientists and organ builders come and discuss what kind of state they should restore the organ, right? Is it original condition in the 18th century or even a little bit later? Because some instruments were rebuilt during these centuries, of course. And sometimes it happens that the organ builder might have made some illogical choices, maybe we might say today mistake, because, for example, at this Holy Ghost Church in Vilnius, where this Gasparini organ was or is, suddenly or without any apparent reason, this design where organ builder plans the design of the instrument, and there is planned in major thirds, right? Sometimes on this particular instrument, where you have tenor C, this layout of the pipes change, and this from this C upward, from tenor C upward, these pipes suddenly are in another location, and it doesn't really make sense musically and even visually. So my long story, of course, but I was asking you, trying to ask you these questions. When the organ builders restore these instruments, do they also restore their apparent mistakes as well?
I'm not sure I can answer that. Neither one of us is a specialist in organ building. I will say that all of these important organs, what lay before their restoration was years of work by committees consisting both of organ builders, not just the builder who was doing it, but organ specialists and musicologists and others who would have any particular kind of knowledge that might be useful in the restoration of the organ. And those decisions were made by that committee, so that it was not a capricious or arbitrary decision by the organ builder or the firm that undertook the restoration. Everything that was done had to pass through a committee of experts, including organ historians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Murrell, how many organs did you see in Germany this time?
I think there were about 10 or 12.
12.
I see. So can you name some of the places you didn't mention before, like Naumburg, of course, and Sturmtal, right, and Leipzig and Dresden? Right. What else?
And we visited the organ in the Dresdner Hofkirche.
Court church.
Mm-hmm.
And then I mentioned we went to Pomsen.
Yes.
And we went, since we could not visit Altenburg, we went to Waltershausen. And we saw a small instrument in the Instrument Museum in Halle, which is by Maurer. And we also saw the Reichel organ in the Markt Church in Halle. We saw the Ladegast organ in Wittenberg. We were not able to actually hear it this time because, once again, the chapel is undergoing renovations and the organ was actually not accessible at all. The organist went up and played a few sounds for us, but the floor was missing below the organ, so that there was no bench, and it was a little difficult. We were lucky to hear a scale. Then we went and heard the Sauer organ in the Berliner Dome. And finally, the last day we did Tangermünde, which is a Scherer organ that was sort of a replacement for the Schnittger organs, which were too far away to correspond to some of Bach's early experience. And then we did the Wagner organ in Brandenburg.
The other one I'd add to that, which is particularly interesting, is the Amalian organ, or Amalia organ, which now resides in a suburb of Berlin called Karlshorst. That organ was built for Princess Anna Amalia, who was the sister of Frederick the Great. And it has to be said that this is a monument of enormous significance, because several of Bach's most important students became connected with the court in Berlin, and Anna Amalia studied the organ under Johann Philipp Kirnberger, who was one of Bach's primary organ students. And she had a passion. She developed a passion for the music of J.S. Bach. So she not only had this organ built for her palace, which has now been lovingly restored, but she also made an enormous collection of Bach manuscripts. And it is thanks to her passion for Bach that the Berlin State Library is now the single, by far, important repository for original manuscripts and prints of J.S. Bach's music.
That's fascinating, because we might also thank Princess Amalia also for another instance, right? Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach wrote his organ sonatas, and I don't know if they were directly connected with the princess or not, but they apparently would sound splendidly on that particular instrument.
You're absolutely right. That is correct.
So wonderful. You visited so broad array of these instruments, starting from the Scherer. It's like 17th century, right? And then
yes, that instrument dates from 1624.
Oh, 16
by far the earliest.
Yes. And then you visited, of course, the Bach era instruments, and also Sauer and Ladegast, who built the organs in the 19th century, right? So this tour probably left an incredible impression on the people who went together with you, right?
I think so. I think one might ask why it is that we visit these instruments from, such as Wittenberg, which has a Ladegast organ from the second half of the 19th century, and then the organ in the cathedral in Berlin, which is actually dates from 1906. It's a 20th century organ. Why did we visit those organs? Well, the reason is this, that the organ building traits that are most evident in the organs that Bach actually had something to do with, that is Naumburg and Altenburg, those organ traits became the guidelines for instruments that were built for the next century and a half or more. So that when you look at and when you hear and play an instrument like Wittenberg, you can clearly see the connection with the earlier instrument, such as, in particular, Altenburg, with many 8-foot stops, string stops. In the case of Naumburg, even a voce humana, a principal celeste stop, which many people would never connect with Bach, but it's there, and we know it was there when Bach played it. Then the same thing can be said for the Sauer organ in the Berlin Cathedral from 1906. It's a monster instrument. I think it has 106 ranks. And of course, it's not tracker action. It's a kind of tubular pneumatic action. But again, this same basic design concept of many 8-foot stops and a very rich full bass, bass frequencies. Those things are absolutely characteristic of the major organs that are connected with J.S. Bach, such as Altenburg and Naumburg. The decisive break with that tradition comes with the advent of the organ reform movement in the first half of the 20th century. That movement ostensibly was a return to earlier instruments, not Bach instruments, more connected with the Schnittkers in the north, which are, of course, not really Bach instruments. But those instruments, the builders of those instruments, thought they knew better. And so they often used modern materials which are not very well suited for the instrument. But in particular, they opted for instruments that had relatively little 8 and certainly very little 16-foot presence in the organ, and whose sound was mostly characterized by the very large and very aggressive mixture work.
Mm-hmm.
Those instruments are absolutely not part of the Bach tradition, whereas the 19th century instruments, such as the Ladegast, and the 20th century instruments, such as the one in Berlin Cathedral, are in fact the direct successors of the Bach organ.
That's a great idea, and I didn't think about this particular trend in organ building this way, that Albert Schweitzer, who started this organ reform movement, or as Germans say, Orgelbewegung, he thought probably that because he loved the music of Bach, of course, he thought that he would encourage organ builders to try to return to the Bach style, right? But in reality, what they copied more is more northern German examples with harsh mixtures and very few foundation stops.
And it's also fair to say that they went beyond those instruments. If you play those Schnittkers and listen to them, they're not as aggressive as in terms of their upper work as the organs of the organ reform movement. And it's not fair to blame Albert Schweitzer for this. Albert Schweitzer was a pioneer in the revival of Bach's organ works. We all owe him an enormous debt. It is the builders who, under his influence, and really under the influence of the whole first half of the 20th century, which, if you look at the music, it's characterized by great clarity and kind of a spiky kind of sound. And that's exactly what you encounter in organs of the Orgelbewegung or organ reform movement.
So we can probably safely say that Albert Schweitzer didn't intend that Orgelbewegung would end in this way, or continue in this way.
I think that's true. Let's face it, Albert Schweitzer, as major a figure as he was for the music of Bach, he spent most of his life in Africa. And, as a medical missionary. And so he was really rather cut off from day-to-day contact with what was happening in organ building.
Yes. So can we compare this organ building reform movement to what happened to the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican Council, right? Because the Second Vatican Council didn't also expect this kind of shift in musical ideas that shaped the Roman Catholic Church, the future of the musical ideas. They didn't intend, right, for these 60 or more years, but they did, right? It was sort of different idea at first, but it developed fairly wildly and freely in a very different direction.
I think you're absolutely right. That you have the pioneers, either Albert Schweitzer or the fathers of the Second Vatican Council, and then you have the culture which accepts and works with those ideas. And of course, that means that the ideas are interpreted through the characteristics of the culture, and they get changed as a result of it.
Yes, local bishops probably make a great influence on accepting certain cultural traditions, like pop music influence, right? On certain occasions, and then it transfers from one country to another because of the influence of the radio and TV, of course.
Absolutely. I think rather than the bishops, to some degree one could say, I think those kinds of things in the Second Vatican Council were really the result of parish priests. And we've watched subsequent popes rein in some of those things. That is, insist that we have gone too far and things need to be rectified that were never really intended by the fathers of the Second Vatican Council.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us also to the organ world. That Albert Schweitzer, sort of the founding father of the organ reform movement, started these ideas, but so to say, not bishops, not priests, but organ builders who developed this idea of making the instrument sound very harsh with very few foundations and strong and high pitched mixtures and mutations is completely probably different from what Albert Schweitzer thought and what contemporaries of Johann Sebastian Bach wrote about organ building in the early days.
Absolutely. Well, another thing that has to be said was that Albert Schweitzer thought that the organs of Gottfried Silbermann were the ideal organs for Bach, and of course, that in itself presents many problems, because Silbermann did not build most of his organs in any kind of certainly not an equal temperament, but he actually built them in temperaments in which it's really not possible to play in some of the more distant keys in which Bach wrote his organ music. So that's a fundamental misconception that Albert Schweitzer shared. Of course, my guess is, and this is only a guess, that by the time Schweitzer encountered those Silbermann instruments, that they had been retuned. And so that they were in equal temperament, or at least in some kind of well temperament, so that they could be played on in all keys. But we know now that those instruments were not in well temperament.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the choice of Silbermann as the Bach organ for Albert Schweitzer came because of this, of this. Basically prolific, because he was so prolific and built so many organs, right? And his influence was enormous in this part, in Saxony at least. So maybe it was so easy to pick the most famous and prolific organ builder, as opposed to maybe other lesser known and maybe sort of a builder of stranger organs like Johann Gottfried Trost, for example.
Yes. Well, the other thing to realize is that the Silbermann organs that Schweitzer knew were not the organs of Gottfried Silbermann. The organs that he was most familiar with were the organs of Gottfried Silbermann's younger brother, Andreas, who did his apprenticeship under his brother and then subsequently moved to Alsace, I think Strasbourg. And so that was the region where Schweitzer was active. And so it was those organs that Schweitzer knew rather than, and was really familiar with, rather than the organs in Thuringia and Saxony, which was, of course, the territory where Bach was. It's not that that Schweitzer didn't know about those organs, but in his day-to-day encounter with the organs, they were the organs of Johann Andreas Silbermann and not of Gottfried Silbermann.
Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating because Andreas Silbermann had a strong influence probably on the French organ culture as well, or connection at least.
Yes, that's unquestionably true, and he certainly did influence it.
Uh-huh. So, Mary Murrell, on your Bach organ world tour, did people have possibility to touch and play some of these instruments?
The way we usually conduct the tour is to go to an instrument, and either the local organist will play something for us so we all get to hear the instrument, preferably from the nave downstairs rather than from the organ loft, because the organ loft is usually the worst place to hear the instrument. If someone is not available, then either Quentin or I would play something, a few short things, so that they could hear the various sounds. Then everyone who wished to play had opportunity to play.
Mm-hmm.
Then we encouraged them once they had played. Some of them stay. We had several people, and we often stayed upstairs because it's helpful to pull the stops for the organist because, of course, they're not at all familiar with the instrument. But we encouraged everybody to sit downstairs as much as possible at a distance, because that's the way you really can hear the organ.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that's fascinating to hear the organ from the point of view of the listener, right? Not only from the point of view of the organist, but also from downstairs, and that's probably a completely different perspective.
No.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
The organ, right next to the organ, what you inevitably hear is the closest division, which is usually something like a Brustwerk. Which is down closer to the organist. And of course, the Brustwerk tends to be the most aggressive. It's the softest division, but it tends to have the least weight and gravity. There's much more weight, much more gravity in the grand organ, the pedal, so that you hear an entirely distorted sound of the organ when you sit at the organ playing desk.
Yes, that's completely true, of course. And Mary Murrell, what kind of people usually go on these tours? Are they all organists or just music lovers and lovers of Bach particular instruments?
There is an assortment. We had professors with us. We had people who played lots of concerts. We have people who just love Bach, who barely play. We had people who traveled with organists who were not organists at all. So there's room for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And of course, organists touch the organ and the instruments themselves, right? They try to play them. Or non-organists try to enjoy the music from downstairs, probably.
That, and often they were thrilled to come up and run the cameras to take some pictures that would attest to the fact that they had actually played on these instruments.
Oh, yes. And then later share these pictures with their friends and family, of course.
Right.
Right. And then when you play these instruments, these old instruments that Bach played or other romantic masters played, for example, do local organists, modern organists of these places also play recitals there for you, for your tour specifically?
Sometimes. For instance, in the Berliner Dome, we met with the organist, Andreas Seeling, and he was kind enough, first of all, to play us a recital. It was before the church was open, so we had wonderful access to hear it. we all sat downstairs, and he played us about a half-hour program. And then we all went upstairs, and he showed us various aspects of the instrument, demonstrated the Rollschwelle, which is something that interests all American organists because we see them so seldom. And then what we had not expected was that he actually gave a chance for people to play it. And this was the first time that's happened. We've been there. But it was a high experience.
That's a perfect, the Berliner Dome, the cathedral is a perfect example of the challenges that these organs all present for those of us who go on the tour, because I mentioned the whole business of dimensions and how they're different. In the case of the Berliner Dome, we have an instrument with 106 stops, and trying to make sense of an enormous console like that with 5 manuals and all of these different kinds of playing aids.
They have a set of free combination kind of things, but each stop has 3 switches, whether or not you want to set it on the various combinations. So there are an immense amount of extra things on the console.
Technical. And then there's the Rollschwelle, which is analogous to the crescendo pedal on American organs. But the Rollschwelle is just a revolving drum that the organist kicks with his foot, either in away or back. It just revolves. Those kinds of devices require an immense amount of practice to really be able to use skillfully. So in that case, we suggested that everyone either sit downstairs or go up stairs and actually watch him perform the instrument at the instrument. Playing the organ was I think, would not have brought any of the tour participants much enlightenment in terms of getting an impression of the organ.
Wonderful, wonderful, Quentin. And I think we have to mention that on this Sauer organ that you mentioned, of course, Max Reger's music sounds particularly well, right?
That is the organ in the Berlin Cathedral is the Reger organ par excellence.
Yeah, or Siegfried Karg Ehlert probably also.
Exactly.
Yeah, these early 20th century composers who wrote music, very chromatic music, very dramatic music. Sometimes people say hysterical music, right? But nobody can really appreciate this music on the most extent without even touching or seeing the Sauer instruments.
It's only fair to say on their behalf, though, that those composers, those musicians, had an enormous reverence for the music of J.S. Bach, and they wrote pieces on BACH in homage, and they really revered the man and his music.
Yes, and in one way or another, these instruments also serve as an example of historical tradition of beginning of 20th century, how organists play Bach legato, right? In these places, yeah. They still played. Straube played there probably, and others played on these Sauer and tubular pneumatic organs. Johann Sebastian Bach's music. So I think even in 21st century, it's kind of very curious to see and hear how our beloved Bach music might have sounded at the beginning of the 20th century, isn't it?
There are actually editions of Bach's music done at this time with instructions on how to play them, changing registrations with the use of the Rollschwelle and so forth and so on. And some organists in Europe have actually begun to include these pieces on their programs, especially if the organ is appropriate, because they are, although they may not be historically correct, they turn out to be wonderful pieces of music because it's a collaboration then of Bach and the later composers such as Karg Ehlert or Max Reger.
That's wonderful, Quentin. And tell me, how many times have you already led this tour? Was it for the fourth time?
This was the fourth time that we led this tour. We led one as part of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Organ Conference, which was different in concept, but it went to many of the same instruments. And so it's the fifth time we've toured many of these instruments, but Bach's Organ World Tour has happened 4 times.
Mm-hmm. And who organizes this tour if people are interested in checking it out?
Concept Tours in New York City.
Concept Tours, okay. I'll make sure I'll include the link to them next to this conversation, because are you planning to lead this tour next year too?
No, we don't. We've never led it every year. It's been every other year, and in fact, this one has been for reasons that we didn't want to conflict with the National Convention of the American Guild of Organists. It was 3 years since we've led the last tour. Plans are now underway. We're talking with the head of Concept Tours. He's interested in developing something that may combine the dual emphasis of the Bach and Bach's organ world with the fact that 2017 is the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation. And so we're just talking about that now. There are no definite plans.
It's amazing how your musical experience and your musical adventures might continue in the future, right? From Bach to the Lutheran world, you have so broad, comprehensive knowledge about all things musical and Bach and probably sacred music as well. So I'm pretty sure that the people who will go on this tour, wherever it will go or whatever the topic will be, I'm sure they will be so delighted.
Well, you can never learn enough about Bach. You can always learn more.
Yeah. So Quentin and Mary Murrell, I'm so grateful for you that you agreed to have this conversation. It was indeed very inspirational for me, and I hope for many of our listeners around the globe now, listening to us online, and some of them will definitely want to go there as part of your tours, of course, and not necessarily when you lead, but just to see what's there, maybe on their own, to travel to Naumburg, to Stormtam, maybe even Altenburg's church will be open the next time. How you think?
Possible. That's of course a difficult thing. That's one of the benefits of going on a tour, because all of those arrangements are made in advance, and I think anybody can understand that the administrations of these churches cannot cope with huge numbers of people coming in and asking if they can play the organ and so forth and so on, so that the tour offers the particular advantage of all of that being arranged in advance.
Mm-hmm. I agree 100%, because just like in Paris, of course, all these famous French organs and organists and improvisers and composers work there and still are active in these churches, in Grand Cathedral, right, and in basilicas, and people from all over the world want to come there and listen to these recitals, and even come to the organ balcony to sit and make pictures and videos of these virtuosos, right? And it's extremely difficult to get there, but sometimes they are lucky, and sometimes it's possible to get even to touch these significant instruments themselves.
It's a great privilege.
Yeah. So once again, thank you, Quentin and Mary Murrell, for the work you do for the organ world across the board, right? Not only from the US, but people from the Asia probably come to these tours, right? From other European countries go to these tours. So it's mostly,
I think we've had Canadians, but it's mostly Americans because he only does advertising within the United States and Canada. So
I see. So English speaking, of course, tour guides like you and Murrell make it so easy and simple to communicate. And you probably have local guides that speak German too.
Well, we do occasionally have, but there are two. Yes, a tour director travels with us. Actually, it's a man and wife, and the man is German. He lives in Canada, but he is a German by birth, and his wife speaks fluent German. So we're well taken care of.
Great. So when you come back to the United States after this tour, when you came back, basically, do you have a strong church responsibilities that you play at St. James?
Yes, there's that, but I think the most alarming thing was that when we returned home, between what was in junk mail and what was in our inbox, we had 550 email messages.
Wow.
So that was one of the things that took several days. And then, of course, overcoming jet lag. But we're basically back in normalcy at this point.
Excellent. So I wish you, Quentin and Murrell, wonderful musical adventures in the future and lots of organ of J.S. Bach and beautiful playing and beautiful instruments that they continue to influence and inspire you and through you other people around you.
Thank you very much, Vidas. And please greet Oshra from us. We're delighted to have talked with you, and we hope we get another chance.
Excellent. We'll keep in touch. I'll make sure we have a conversation about sacred music, because we have to mention that both you and Murrell are long-time church musicians, right? Probably you started playing when you were probably students, right? And still continue to this day. So if nothing else, you are probably not only Bach experts, but also great experts of sacred music and all things that connect with the sacred music also.
Thank you very much for this.
Okay, so see you in another conversation.
Wonderful.
If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog Secrets of Organ Playing at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice, and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Vidas Pinkevicius. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.